Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I actually rise to support the government's changes to the Competition and Consumer Act as defined by the bill itself. And it's interesting to hear the previous member talk about studies and all sorts of other things. Well, I can talk about a lived experience, because it was the actual access to justice issue that helped to bring me into this place through a lived experience, not through some study. And that is why competition policy and this bill is so important to small businesses just like my own. Part of the reason that I came here, as I said, is someone who owns and absolutely built a small business from the ground up, and it was the access to justice issue, which is why I support the government's bill. And we were typical of the majority of small businesses right around Australia. We actually bought our first business, a dairy farm, on the day that we got married. Yes, it was run down. Yes, it had very little infrastructure, and it had a pretty mixed old herd. And of course, it was tough going. We lived in 2 army huts joined together, and the simple economics of it were very interesting for us. Our interest and payments were basically we actually had received about $2,000 a month, and our interest and payments were $1,300 a month, and we basically had to grow a business, do all the development and live with that sort of an income. And we bought this on the day we got married with just $12,000 worth of equity between us, and we had $118,000 worth of debt. We took a huge risk as 2 young people. I was 18 and he was 21. And I would really like $1. I'd like $1 for everyone who laughed at us and for everyone who said we would go broke and fail. But like most small business owners know only too well, it takes courage, it takes debt as the great motivator, it takes sleepless nights. This is the real lived experience, not a study. It takes those sleepless nights wondering how you're going to pay your bills and getting up to carve cows in the middle of the night, especially when at the time interest rates went from 17 to 23%. It takes hard work over many, many years. This is not a short-term investment when you're a small business person. And in fact, it was actually a separate contract hay baling round that my husband went out and did in between milkings, me raking and at times baling and mowing hay, as well as my husband, that kept us afloat in the early years. And in fact, it was 8 years before my husband and I could actually afford a holiday. And the Competition and Consumer Act was called the Trade Practices Act at that time. And I saw immediately how competition, or the lack thereof, affected our business. It was actually at the cattle sales, where we sold culled cows and sometimes dairy store cattle. There was a limited number of buyers, and they would frequently decide, well in advance of the sale, actually which pens of cattle each would be buying, and therefore not compete with each other. This of course meant that we as the sellers received far less than we should have in what should have been an open and fair marketplace. They were even brazen enough in those days to call out across the pens as to whose turn it was to buy and not to bid on my pen. And I learnt very early on as a dairy farmer in a regulated environment, and I learnt that the government decisions had a major impact on my business, which is why I got so involved early. And that following deregulation of the industry in 2000, the vulnerability of being the producer of one of the most perishable products in what is in WA a majority domestic market, with a very few buyers, a lot of sellers. And one thing I learnt was that we actually had no bargaining power. In fact, we became absolute price takers, as we see today with current contracts. So that's why measures in this bill continue to be so important. And as Chair and member of Dairy Western Australia, we worked with dairy farmers to set up a milk negotiating agency with voluntary membership by those same dairy farmers. We actually applied to the ACCC at the time for authorisation through a collective bargaining process. And what blew me away at the time was actually the attitude of the ACCC at that time. And I remember vividly that meeting in Perth. And I walked in to present the case for what was around 300 dairy farmers at the time. And I was really concerned about the need to change the ACCC because their disdain was palpable. And in fact, there was a comment made at the time that they were particularly disappointed at the submission made by myself and Dairy WA because they'd previously done an inquiry into Air New Zealand and Qantas and expected something along those lines. Well, when you consider that I was representing a group of dairy farmers who were going through very tough times, I reminded them that they were small business people and this was the best that we could do. And I knew when we walked out of that meeting that we were done. Our plans to set up the agency and then potentially attract manufacturing and export investment simply would not happen because, not surprisingly, the ACCC at that time said that this action would substantially affect competition, and they refused for us to set up a milk negotiating agency. So when I look at where the dairy industry in WA is at today, and the 3 farmers who were put out of business last year when their contracts were not renewed, Graham Manning, Tony Ferraro and Dale Hanks, I just wonder where the industry would have been today had the ACCC approved that application that we made back in 2005. And I would suggest it would look entirely different. To add insult to injury, we basically had, I presented to the ACCC some information about breaches to the Trade Practices Act that made us even more vulnerable, which is why I support so strongly the work of the government in this bill. And there were 4 breaches of the Trade Practices Act that included third-line forcing. And at the time, they were not acted on. In fact, one very salutary lesson for me was the fact that one of the processors that gave me information about what was actually going on in the marketplace with their interaction was that he wouldn't meet me unless it could be in a parking lot in Perth where there were no cameras. So that told me a lot about where we were at as an industry and why the need is for the changes that the government is making. I note that the Harper Review considered that secondary boycotts had not been vigorously enforced by the ACCC compared with other offences. And in fact Harper stated that, as with all competition laws, the secondary boycott laws will only act as a deterrent to unlawful behaviour if the laws are enforced consistently and effectively, which is what the government is intending to do. Now, I'm counting on the ACCC to be a completely different entity today. It has moved on, and with a lot of action from this government. And I want to see the ACCC actually focused on small business. I'm looking forward to some very strong recommendations from their current inquiry into the competitiveness of prices, trading practices and the supply chain in the Australian dairy industry. And of course, it is subject to intense focus by my dairy farmers. And there are a number of the inquiry considerations that they'll be very interested in. The nature of competition between processors for both acquisition of raw milk and the supply of processed milk and dairy products. The nature of commercial relationship between dairy producers and acquirers of raw milk. The terms on which raw milk is acquired from dairy producers and the means by which such terms are agreed. And the existence of, or potential for, anti-competitive conduct and the possible impacts of any such conduct on businesses within the supply and dairy chain. And I want to talk as well, Mr Deputy Speaker, about other measures that this government is taking, not just the measures within this bill that I support. Also, the Office of the Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman that we set up, this government set up, not Labor Party, our government set up this as an independent advocate for small businesses like my own that went through those challenges. It supports small business efforts to be innovative, to employ and to thrive. That's what it should be about, and that's what this agency is about. The key principles of a fair and competitive trading framework, well, that's exactly what I want to see as a small business owner and someone that's built a business. One of the Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman's principles is adequate access to justice for small business where there is likely to be a significant imbalance of bargaining power. And I look at the assistance, the pre-mediation and the alternative dispute resolution available through that office. They're looking at payment times and practices inquiry, the small business loans inquiry, and of course the impact of the Road Safety Remuneration Tribunal payments order. And this had a huge impact, RSRT, on small businesses in my electorate. And of course, this was one that I saw so many small businesses in absolute dire straits. These are small family-owned enterprises. And of course, what were some of the key findings of the Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman's inquiry? That the payments order resulted in owner-drivers in the long-distance and supermarket distribution sectors being made uncompetitive. And of course, there was uncertainty and anxiety for owner-drivers about the impact of these, and they were extremely complex and had a short implementation time. And I note one of the key parts of this. One of the key findings was that it is with great regret and sympathy that it was reported to the inquiry that some owner-drivers found they were unable to cope with further hardship caused by the payments order and took their own lives. Well, when we talk about the real world of how decisions made in this place actually impact on small business people and individuals, there is no greater indication than this one. And I want to thank every small business owner, particularly those owner truck drivers, who came out and supported us, often under significant pressure from unions. And there was significant pressure from unions on those small business owners at the time. And they had courage, the courage that it took them to actually start their own business in the first place, invest, mortgage their home, and they've been consistent in their efforts ever since. They understand exactly it is this coalition government, the Turnbull government, that stood up for small businesses in the RSRT issue. It was a very significant one, putting small business owners actually out of business and worse. And I saw so many of them in my electorate. And I want to acknowledge the work that they do as a transport industry. We take them for granted, but they are small businesses who do it tough, who are on the road, and basically Australia pretty well runs on the back of the trucks of those small business owners, and I want to acknowledge their efforts. And I also want to, again, support the measures that the government is taking with this bill. Mr Deputy Speaker, small business is a key part of the reason why the amendments and this bill are so important. I can, as I've said, from personal experience and from building and developing a small business and the challenges that go with it, I want to acknowledge every small business out there that is investing, that is having a go, and they know that this government is there supporting them through the changes to this bill.